Hello, that's working now, I think.
One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Hello,
9,
hello.
10.
Yeah.
Test. Yeah. Test, test. Hello and welcome to our next panel. I'm Will Jackson-Moore. I lead PwC's Global Sustainability Practice, and today we're going to have an exciting panel with a range of participants who I'll get to introduce in a second, all around the demand side of energy. So I'm joined by Pim Valdry from World Economic Forum, and I'll let everybody just introduce themselves a little bit more when they first answer a question. I've got Rob Turner, a colleague who leads our energy transition team, and then finally Ankit Toddy from Mahindra, and we're looking forward to hear about some of the kind of practical things that you're doing at Mahindra. So by way of context, in terms of the energy transition, quite rightly, there's an enormous amount of focus on supply side and what we need to do as business, as organisations and the planet to really decarbonise the supply side. However, particularly given the pace of movement that we need to have in order to meet kind of 2030 commitments, the easiest thing for us to do is not use as much energy. And that may be a little bit kind of blunt and simple, but that is by far the easiest way to decarbonise is not to use the energy in the first place. Estimates suggest that if energy demand continues to grow at current rates through to 2050, we'll easily see 30% plus additional energy being used. Whereas our indications and our reviews have indicated we can reduce energy demand by 30% in the next decade if we drive more energy efficiency projects. And so today we're going to kind of discuss some of those topics, why that's important, and what are some of the barriers against achieving it, but then what are some of the practical things that we can do. So maybe, Rob, if I could start with you. Reducing energy demand, let's be really simple. Why does it make economic business sense?
Well, reducing demand makes economic and business sense simply because it's a cost of activity. So if you could do the same thing, get the same economic output by using less energy, you've got an immediate productivity gain. That's the very simple answer. The question is, if it's that simple, why would a rational business not be pursuing that on an ongoing basis? So what is the business as usual question? If it's possible to do it, why isn't it happening? Well, the answer is in the statistics. The IEA is estimating that we gain productivity in the economy by about 1.5% a year. So we are increasing the efficiency in terms of energy use by 1.5, 1.7% a year. So that's great, arguably, but that's business as usual. A lot of people will be aware the IEA's talked about needing to get to 4.5% in order to hit the net zero trajectory that they're calling for. So you'd have to triple that number pretty much to get on target. So how would you do that? The question then is, well, are there big technical barriers? Are there big capital barriers? And are there simply affordability issues stopping demand action? And I think the answer is very clearly not. So most efficiency measures are actually entirely deliverable from a technological perspective and entirely deliverable from a capital and cost perspective. But, and this is the question, Will, so I've said it ought to happen, it's totally technically possible, and it's affordable, but it's not happening. So why isn't it happening? There's a big issue around awareness in organisations and the focus on energy demand. And I think if there's one thing that should come out of the demand side conversation at COP and more generally is enhancing that awareness. So getting companies to look at, monitor and manage their energy consumption, be very focused on energy itself, and then to launch ongoing programs around how to keep that number down and get that number down on an incremental basis. Now, Will talked about 30%. That sounds incredible. If I could stand in front of any company and say, I can get you to do what you do today at 30% less energy, that's entirely possible. And we've broken the world out into the building sector, the industrial sector, and the transport sector. And in each instance, we've ended up concluding that something like that 30% number is entirely deliverable with today's technology and affordable. So you've got to work on awareness, you've got to work on monitoring that number, and you've got to work on companies, therefore making them that their priority. But fundamentally, well, it comes back to energy out, cost out, doing the same business but doing it better.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I mean, you would think turning to any board, C-suite, CEO, and saying you could reduce your energy costs by 30%, you would get some action. But we aren't seeing that currently. I mean, Pim, you lead the Alliance of Climate CEOs. What's that discussion? And what are the barriers? Why aren't we seeing that happen?
No, thanks so much, Will, and thanks, Rob, as well. I mean, I think heightened attention to this issue is really long overdue, I would say, and hopefully this can be the COP where we can see clear political will around the doubling of energy efficiency from 2 to 4%. And I think I also saw that IEA predicts that 40% of the emission cuts that we need to see over the next 20 years has to come from energy efficiency. So this is something that we're working at the World Economic Forum. I represent the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders. This is a group of 120 companies that have all set science-based targets. They're disclosing their emissions through CDP, and they're trying with different ways to drive essentially decarbonization. When we look at the demand management side of things, I think our companies are already taking action. They might not be taking all the action they need to, but they certainly are working on a couple of actions across key sectors like transportation, industry, and building. So we are seeing that companies are looking at, retrofitting of buildings, replacement of equipment. They're switching to EV fleets. They are looking at installation of heat pumps. They're also actually taking action in their own hands. If we look at the gridding capacity, which is really low in certain regions, some of our members are simply just building their own microgrids to make sure that they have the right capacity to support electrification. But I think where we're seeing barriers and where we are seeing insufficient action, I would say, are sort of three areas. First of all, we're not using our value chains. We're not using a cluster approach to actually drive scale around a solid demand strategy. So what I would say is that we should look at clusters and groups of companies that could come together to drive grids efficiency and effectiveness, to look at design of circular business models, district heating. There are tons of things you could do at the cluster level. Secondly, right now, we're rolling out a Scope 3 action plan within our members. I mean, one company can sit on 50,000 suppliers, right? Right now, companies are very engaged in setting science-based targets with their suppliers. They should also set energy efficiency targets, right? We should help to support our suppliers to build incentives for that. So that's something we're looking at. Again, coming back to policy, we are not seeing sufficient responses here. We've seen a little bit on the Repower EU, the IRA has had a bit, Japan has also stepped up, but this has to be the COP where we get this fully on the agenda. And then finally, we've been looking a lot at industry decarbonization pathways in the harder to abate sectors, like, on the materials side and on the transport side. Equally, I think these pathways need to be complemented with energy efficiency targets. So that's what I would add as well.
Okay. Anke, I mean, turning to you, you are at the coalface, as it were, of working with a very, very large, diverse group. Maybe you could give us some of the examples that you've been working on as a group to drive energy efficiency, reducing that energy demand that's, as we say, is such a clear need for us.
Thank you for the question. So I would, start by saying that there is often a prevalent narrative. Is it not good? Okay. There's often a prevalent narrative around, growth needs to be in sync with energy demand, but that is not the case. And I'll take a very specific example for a group which is present in, let's say, 7-8 different large sectors, that our business revenues increased by 50% in absolute terms over the last 5 years, while our energy consumption decreased by 20%. So that's a significant energy efficiency gain. And to some of the points Rob made earlier, given energy is one of the most simplest business as usual things, it often does not get the attention that it deserves, which means that in spite of it making clear business sense and it making a clear environment sense, you do not see enough action on that. So the first thing is to create awareness and bring the conversation to the highest level, because it would require a significant number of projects to be sort of anchored by people, by experts, which may not be their core area of focus in a company. That's one point. The second point is that when it comes to talking about specific numbers again, in the case of the Mahindra Group, we use about $100 million worth of electricity in a year. That's a large number. Now, when it comes to energy efficiency, we have been able to get about a 90% increase in energy efficiency over the last few years in both our auto and farm manufacturing sector, which are generally the most energy intensive part of the businesses. At the same time, unlike, let's say, shifting to renewable energy, where you can do one large mega scale project and shift, energy efficiency actually requires you to act on a lot of small pieces. So in the last year itself, we have had more than 300 projects that addressed energy efficiency. And these were also three kinds of projects. So the first is, which is often the most talked about, is shifting to retrofitting energy efficient equipment, etc. That's one leg. There's a significant cost involved in the initial days, and you have a relatively good payback period for those. The second, which is often not talked about, is how do you change certain processes for it to be energy efficient. And to take a very simple example, there are processes in, let's say, paint in the manufacturing sector, which happens at a higher temperature, but it's quite possible to optimize the temperature, which just means that you'll use low energy. So there are lots of process improvements that you can do. And the third is what I would call a little bit of behavioral change and wastage of energy. You could have the best of equipment running 24 hours when you actually need it only for 12 hours. So that's the other element. So focusing on each of these three actions and doing a mix of both hardcore investments in hardware, behavioral changes, as well as technological interventions or process interventions that's required, together you are able to make this change. And it's a long process. So even when I talk about a 90% increase in absolute efficiency, it's not something that happened in 1 year. It's a journey that has been going on for about 7-8 years. The last aspect that I would, again pick on what Rob said, is that it's quite possible to do it across some of the major industries. So right from manufacturing, the example that I spoke about, in the entire built environment, there's significant potential to do that, especially in things like warehousing, use of natural light, etc. You can just reduce the amount of electricity or energy you need during the day. And the same thing also applies in the transport sector, where we have been investing in things like light weighting of vehicles, which again leads to lower use of fuel and energy in a way. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you. I mean, that you brought to life the kind of complexity and that fact that it is often very large numbers of small projects that are required to drive efficiency and decarbonisation more broadly. I mean, one aspect as well that we can drive change here is by getting different parts of the kind of ecosystem to work together. So maybe equipment manufacturers, users, regulators, government standard setters. Who would like to kind of pick up the kind of why getting the kind of different players in these systems working together is so important here?
Well, I'll start happily on that. Pim made the point around needing to get the regulatory support around it, and Ankit's talked about the issue of dispersed, very disaggregated behaviours. You do need to get collaboration between value chains, you do need to get a very, very high degree of awareness in companies working with regulators and otherwise. The challenge, it comes back to awareness, is when we started talking to the World Economic Forum around demand, I'm afraid one of the things I had to say to them initially was, one of the problems is it's not that sexy. It's not a big capital project. It's not a big one-off event. And I'd observe, actually, having been at COP this week, is that still the tendency is to seek the big answers. I need to build out big blobs of renewables. I need to make fundamental changes to the system on the supply side. Those things are all valid and they have to happen. But getting that sort of collaboration, and to pick up Ankit's point, a real laser focus on the thousands of interventions that have to happen to get to this energy saving. And I'll give an example. Both these guys have referred to buildings. Okay, so a number that's estimated by my colleagues at Schneider Electric is that you could take an OECD building park, which represents, in the OECD, is about 30% of energy consumption. And it would be a reasonable estimate that if you were to retrofit the existing buildings, you could reduce consumption in those buildings by upwards of 40%. So ultimately, you could go to a government and say, hey, look, 30% of your demand, like 40% target, you could increase the efficiency of the economy from an energy perspective by 12%. How to do that, and to your point about getting collaboration in the ecosystem, you can't phone a retrofitter. There are people who do roofs, there are people who do plumbing, there are people who do solar, there are people who do floors and access. And in fact, to make it economic, you need building codes to change. You need to get the asset owners working with the asset users. So it's an incredibly complex ecosystem. The number is quite simple to articulate. I've just done it. It's 12%. But getting that level of collaboration and that level of focus is the big challenge. And again, I found it time after time, even this week, people can get their head around launching a hydrogen project. Launching that buildings intervention is launching a whole ecosystem of retrofitting across the economy. But to the point you made when you kicked off, Will, as I think Fatih Birol said, the energy you don't use is the cheapest energy in the world. If you could get there, 12% efficiency improvement in the economy, amazing, but it's a huge amount of coordination and collaboration. Pim.
If I can also just add on that, I think even in the big mega projects that we're looking at in sort of greening industry, for instance, if we look at the massive push for green steel in northern Sweden, for instance, there's a complete lack of awareness of where's the energy going to come from. And therefore, we need to be much more energy efficient. Actually, if you look at the H2 green steel and the hybrid projects up north, it will require the amount of approximately 80 terawatt hours of energy up to 2045. That's equivalent to Finland's annual energy consumption. We don't have the gridding. We do not have, of course, the supply, but neither we will have to be much, much more economical, even for the bigger sort of, if you will, sexy projects. Energy efficiency has to come in there from the very beginning. So I think the link to policymakers is absolutely critical. And actually, just before coming on this panel, I was sitting in just listening into the event before here, where I heard the mayor of New Jersey talk about that he had a mini COP just before coming to this COP, and actually he had also done his own stock take at the sort of local level, and whereby working to really incentivize buyers and producers when it comes to retrofitting of buildings. It really starts there as well, and I think we need to sort of see that COP at every single local level, and energy efficiency has to be part of that conversation.
Rob, you touched on the built environment earlier on, and I think the statistic is that globally 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 are already being built. So clearly those buildings and the retrofit ask is huge. But for countries that haven't got that kind of legacy, so the developing world where a lot of new buildings are being built very rapidly at the moment. What should the approach be for that developing world rather than developed world around the kind of energy efficiency debate?
Well, I saw Ankit nodding, and I'll let him come in on it. It comes back to regulation. Okay, there are plenty of companies doing great stuff voluntarily. and that's to be embraced and to be applauded. At the same time, you need to get regulation, but also planning aligned around how the built environment is going to emerge. I think the stats I've seen is something like well over 90% of the buildings required in 2050 in Europe already exist, and under 90% of the buildings required in Africa in 2050 exist. So you do have a very, very different equation depending on where you're looking. It comes to building codes, it comes to materials, it comes to embedding behaviours in town planning and that kind of thing, which again, it comes back to the same thing, coordination of different stakeholders. It's the same point you made earlier. So you need to have efficiency targets at an economy level, you need building codes within the building industry, and then you need the building industry to align and develop their own implementation strategies relevant to the local environment. And again, the classic question is going to be, are you going to build the same kinds of buildings in the Middle East or is the same kind of buildings you have in Africa? And the answer is clearly not. So it has to be a very local strategy. But the message, though, to governments has to be on the new buildings, the real challenge, and we've seen this in all these big sectors, is anything you plan in now from a building perspective is embedded consumption for the next 30 or 40 years. And that's the real message. If you get it wrong in the next 5 years, you're going to be in an impossible position from a consumption perspective in 20 or 30 years' time, because you can't afford to knock down building stock and rebuild it. So there is a real imperative to go for new building design from the outset. The good news, again, is the engineering sector is saying it's perfectly possible. But I'll give you another stat that I've learned this week. For example, in the Middle East, on average, buildings in the Middle East today are 20% less efficient than the global average. So the gap closure opportunity simply to get building codes aligned here with the rest of the world is extraordinary. So again, it starts with regulation and it's then working with the supply chain. But you were saying, I think, had something to say, Anka, on that.
I actually wanted to just add a point that it's actually true that there is a humongous opportunity in the developing world because you are designing new buildings and building them. So if you get them right in the beginning, you just incrementally save on so much future cost. And the way to sort of do that is exactly building codes are a way to do that. But at the same time, I would still say sort of creating more awareness with the designers, architects, etc. and sort of very conclusively show them with numbers that this is the business case for each and every metric. So you can clearly show benchmarks for commercial space, for warehousing space, for all kinds of other infrastructures, and what is the best in class that you can go and what is the quantum of money that you can actually save by doing that upfront, little bit of upfront investment. So in fact, that's something, and to Pim's point earlier, that as this understanding matures with the larger companies because of, let's say, the size of the savings that they have, it's imperative to take it to the MSME sector and to show them that this is very much in their interest, climate action, which is also business action, business positive action, so that there's huge opportunity to actually act on that area. And in fact, internally, I'm sharing this, is that we are looking to do this in a more systematic manner with some of the learnings over the last decade, to at least take it to our MSMEs particularly and give them these sort of both hand-holding but at the same time followed by targets. So you need a little bit of both to move in the Indian context at least.
Pim.
No, I was just going to say, I think when we discuss adaptation and resiliency methods, right, I think from what we've seen from our members at business, right, the focus has been very, very much on mitigation and decarbonization. Actually, at COP26, or actually COP27 in Egypt, we were talking about adaptation and resilience as the poor cousin of mitigation. I think we're seeing much more focus on resiliency this COP, and I think it would be very welcome to also integrate an energy efficiency approach to the metrics of what is resilience. Because if companies are looking at adaptation as a business case, because we need the new buildings of tomorrow that are going to stand for, these climate impacts, then if we can couple that with metrics also on energy efficiency, I think we can help boost the retrofitting, the new buildings, the new transportation systems that we need to see in fragile areas.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear that it is possible to build those buildings, And I've had some really interesting sessions with leading architects who they've got the plans. They can build a 1.5 degree aligned building. Most of the building codes around the world, even the very best, are still actually a 3 degree aligned world. So the plans are there, and we do need the largest corporates to really do that kind of demand generation by demanding the best buildings rather than just even meeting the best standards, which we can go much further than that.
There's also a question on financing, and that's one thing I think gets missed. So I've emphasised building codes, and we've all reflected on the same thing. The question of affordability and financing and matching those two things. I'll give you an example. I sat in a workshop while we were doing this research, and someone was talking about this amazing new building, and it was a classic presentation in this domain. You know, great pictures of the building, wonderful energy savings, architects all over it. And then someone put their hand up at the end and said, okay, so tell me a bit more about this. Just tell me roughly how much the building costs more than building it to the existing codes. And the architect said, oh, it's great, actually, it's only 20%. And we nearly lost the discussion, and I've seen everybody in the room has kind of gone, yeah, smile, and we nearly lost the room, because there was almost like a collective shrug, which is, okay, it's the same message as we're seeing all the way across the sustainability and the environmental debate. It would be great to, you know, eat organic vegetables, but they cost 20% more. It would be great to have energy efficient buildings, but they cost 20% more. The difference between organic vegetables and efficient buildings is you've got to believe in the health benefit of those vegetables, but it's not very easy to measure. On the buildings, with high energy costs and energy insecurity, you absolutely can measure it. So you've got a financial asset. So while Mahindra might be a great example of a company saying, I can measure it, value it, and embed it into my planning, the interesting question, I think, is to bring finance in to start funding the asset that's been created, which is the energy saving. And that, you know, when someone's looking at renting a building, looking at what the asset they've got, their lower energy costs, or when people are, you know, planning out the financing of a whole development, there is an asset that's being created, which is lower energy costs over the life of the building. That has to be financeable. And I think there is. So in thinking about the ingredients list, we've talked about awareness, which is businesses owning the problem and understanding it. We've talked about regulation, but also recognising that energy savings is an asset which should be financeable, and there should be returns which can be given, and therefore there should be more capital flowing into efficiency in the same way as people are calling for capital for big projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. Some of the most kind of forward-looking real estate investors are now getting switched on to the fact that do they really want to be building something which could become a stranded asset in 20 years' time? Because, okay, if the upfront capex cost is 20% higher, but if you've got a building that's got zero residual value, if you go with a cheaper option, what's the kind of whole lifetime cost of it? So I think that debate needs to be had, and people need to start realising that if you're not building the most efficient buildings possible, you're building a potential obsolete asset. In the same way, people think around fossil fuel energy generation and say you're building an obsolete asset. It's the same thing. You're building an obsolete building. One of the other things we've touched on is the fact that it's a kind of myriad of small projects that's required, but adding great value. I was talking to one large corporate earlier this week who said one of the challenges they've got is that the paybacks, everybody's always super conservative, and the efficiency schemes are kind of 7-year paybacks on. He said, but they've never had one where actually the payback has been more than 3 years when they've actually kind of implemented. So yet another kind of data point that this is exactly what we should be doing. But as somebody said, these aren't fitting draft excluders around your door is probably one of the best payback projects ever, whether you're in a hot country or a cold country. But it doesn't exactly make it onto the CEO agenda. And so what can we do to kind of support CEOs, chief sustainability officers, to kind of increase the kind of profile of the 50 small projects we need to do rather than, to your point, Rob, building the next hydrogen plant. I mean, maybe Pim, could I start with you? I mean, what can we do to help?
Yeah. No, I think we also need to look at the board level, right? At the forum, we do a lot of work at the C-suite, but we're increasingly turning our attention to governance, because there's a recent study that only 29% of chairs and directors on boards feel that they have enough competence and knowledge to actually navigate their company through the crisis in an efficient way. And so equally, I think we need to look at who's actually sitting on our boards. Do they have the right stewardship mindset? Do they have the right competencies to actually make climate a priority for boards? Because they're also tackling issues like geopolitical issues, cybersecurity, AI. So we're trying to actually mobilize global boards at a massive scale, and we have 30 communities and covering 71 jurisdictions where we're training NEDs and also chairs on this topic. So I think I think we've seen a mindset shift at the forum among CEOs the last couple of years in terms of the transition. I think you can sit down today with the CEOs from those companies that are serious, and you can talk about how do you set internal carbon pricing, how do you link climate performance to remuneration, how do you put together your climate team. But I think we're not seeing that shift at the chair level, and I think if we are to also get the energy efficiency on the agenda fully into the net zero transition plans, into the industry transition plans that are coming from the industry sectors, I think there's something to be said to also work at the board level.
I mean, how does it work at Mahindra? How does the board really get behind this?
So I'll sort of use this, commitment, measurement, action, reporting. We started with a commitment to double energy productivity. We started measuring what our energy use is at a per unit level. And it's not simple to just measure electricity consumption, but what production, how do you normalize it across industries. Then there were a series of hundreds of projects across dedicated teams with the responsibility to do this, baked into KRAs and actions, and then aggregate level reporting back to the board, along with clear overall level guidelines in terms of what's the savings. Talking not specifics of the project on what it got done, but rather talking in terms of numbers, that what's the magnitude of the savings that's happening without any active intervention, let's say, from senior management, but it still gets you bottom line. So that's as simple as that. In fact, just to add further, on the payback period, that's the other sort of realization, is that unlike many other areas of action, if I may take, let's say, action on water or just transition or waste management, energy efficiency is actually one of the easiest to get through, because the commercial case is often always extremely aligned with the financial requirements of the business. So less than 3-year payback period is almost always the case in all projects. In fact, in some projects you don't even have to spend a significant amount of money and you still get savings. You just have to ensure that it's getting done on an ongoing basis. So the only challenge that I still feel that happens once in a while, and this was more early days, so no longer the case now, was in terms of, let's say, financing, in the internal financing as well, in the absence of clarity on the savings. So there, I think one of the things that has helped now is having clear benchmarks on what's the end goal or what's the best in class possible. So having both internal and external benchmarks helps people be clear that what is being said on paper can actually be delivered over a period of time. So that's probably the only other thing I'll add. That one's working.
This one's working? Oh, no, it's not.
So technically faster.
There's only one of them working now. Okay. We're saving money by reducing the number of microphones we're using. One of the answers we found, and Ankit made the point, is centralisation of the monitoring of energy and centralisation of responsibility. Most businesses are allocating capital to their individual divisions, and often that capital is quite expensive because that capital is oriented towards growth. Okay, so you're mostly telling your divisions, go and grow my business in that geography, in that area, with that new product. Now, if the returns are somewhat different, and you made the point, Will, that we're often seeing 3-year payback, but often projects are getting sanctioned on 5, 6, 7, 8-year payback, you need to create a pot of capital for the efficiency investments and manage that centrally, and centrally then manage the deployment out. So that's one version of centralisation, and allowing companies not to make that unfortunate decision, which is I'd rather see top-line growth here and not focus so much on the bottom-line growth. And where we've seen that centralisation, we've seen the greatest progress on efficiency. So there's centralisation in finding the number, prioritising it, and then allocating the money to make sure the work gets done, even OPEX as well as CAPEX. So that's one point. The other idea that we've posited is, and I'm sure it won't take off in terms of the actual name, but is almost having a chief energy officer. We've got a lot of sustainability people doing fantastic work around the wider carbon debate and the wider ESG footprint of companies, but actually to elevate the conversation about energy and have someone centralising that. Ankit talked about benchmarks. Once you've got these programs going, you've got an internal benchmark on an annual basis. And those companies that we've seen leading on efficiency are often saying, we're just going for 5% a year. So rather than going for the big numbers, and I know I headlined the big numbers of 30%, 40%, that's treating it like a project. I'm going to do one thing, try and make the change and deliver it. But actually 5% a year, that momentum case, and I think Mahendra has talked about some of these extraordinary numbers, is because you've made that commitment every single year and somehow you've managed to deliver every single year. I think that's correct.
There's definitely the other thing is that in many of these cases it's also the maturity curve internally. So there are technologies that are evolving with every passing year. Your understanding of what works better versus not also improves. So I would again re-emphasize the point that this is not a one big project to be done in 1 year. This is like constantly chipping at the stone and you will eventually make through.
Okay. I mean, we've had a rich discussion there across the real practical sides of it. If maybe I'm going to go slightly off script, and just to close it off, if you've got what one ask of a CEO. They're thinking about energy efficiency. Maybe I'll start with Pim. What's that one ask of the CEO when they start on this journey, or maybe words of advice for them?
So I would focus on the scope 3, your supply chain management, so upstream, and I would say set energy efficiency targets with your suppliers and support them. Build in incentives, trainings, as you were saying. How do you set benchmarks? What is in it for them? Start with your integrated into your scope 3 strategy.
Okay. Ankit?
So I would say be aware of that one single number. What is your energy productivity? The way every CEO would know the revenue of the company, the profit of the company, be aware of what is the energy per unit of production. It'll drive all the action that's required.
And I would say in a world where there are too many metrics and too much reporting, I would say energy out, cost out. Find the energy number, conclude you can get it down by 5% a year, and you'll save money, which is more productivity and more growth. Energy out, cost out.
Well, thank you to my panel. Thanks to the audience. I think hopefully that's hit the objective of being very practical about what we need to do around energy efficiency. And as we said, energy not used in the first instance is the best sort of energy. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for doing that. That's good.
They just stop it doing the... Oh,
so they were turning it up and down, so we
it's fine.
No, don't worry. You covered it very well.
Yeah, I worked it out. I worked it out. They had. Yeah. So, yeah. That's all good.
Yeah.